by creating this podcast and exploring these topics, I get to do the slow thinking that goes into how and why we manage poisoning and dream up new ways that we can manage poisoning. So truly, just by creating this little adventure, it's kind of created the time in my life to get to explore things in the way that I want.
Welcome to Continuing Studies, a podcast for higher education podcasters to learn and get inspired. I'm Neil McFedrin, founder of Podium Podcast, an agency for higher education podcasters.
And I'm Jennifer Lee, founder of JPod Creations. Podcasting is broadcasting, and we want you to know you're not alone. In fact, there are many of you higher ed podcasters out there, and we can all learn from each other. Please also join our community at higheredpods.com.
Yeah, and check out some of the updates we've done recently on Higher Ed Pods for searching for cool new university podcasts. But Jen, that's not why we're here today. We're here to talk about our conversation we had with Dr. Ryan Feldman from the Poison Lab podcast. Very cool podcast. So the Poison Lab is this educational podcast where experts, toxicology, and poisoning discuss the infinite poisons the world has to offer. That's from their show description. So what's really cool about this podcast is for sure for healthcare workers and practitioners and whatnot to gain insights and so on and so forth. But it's for any of us to listen to. And Jen, we both listened to a bunch of episodes and it was super interesting. Ryan even has an episode where you can send in questions and ask a toxologist questions and he answers them in that episode. Very cool. Now, Jen, you told me a little secret that you were potentially going to be a pharmaceutical rep one day. So this must have been really interesting for you, especially.
Yeah, when I was in between broadcasting and podcasting, and I thought, hey, wouldn't it be great to be a pharmaceutical salesperson because you'd make lots of money? And I did think about it, but I did not go that route at all.
Well, you wouldn't be here today chatting with me about Dr. Feldman's amazing The Poison Lab podcast if you had.
I do have to say that I hand it to him to do episodes where people call in because I'm like a hypochondriac and I feel like I would just call in and ask him tons of like, oh, I ate this. What happened? So I want to know if he gets tons of people calling in on repeat because I feel like that's just asking for trouble, man.
Yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's get into it. Here is our conversation we had with Dr. Ryan Feldman.
Today we have a really cool guest. Not that we don't usually have cool guests, but we have a really neat guest that's doing something a little bit different. We have Dr. Ryan Feldman, and he does the Poison Lab podcast. And I want to get to know him a little bit more. And of course, I got to ask you this question. Have you ever been poisoned? And did that inspire you to do this podcast?
Not physically, maybe emotionally poisoned by some. No, I think not myself that I know of. I guess I could ask my wife if she's slipping me anything.
I know. I did just listen to your podcast about murders and that most people do try to poison people to kill them. And then I went down a rabbit hole. So I was like, that was pretty interesting. Always seems that arsenic seems to be like the culprit on that. I listened to a ton of true crime recently and it's like everyone poisons with arsenic. No one goes outside the box.
Yeah. They used to call that the powder of inheritance.
Yeah, I like that. That's funny.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Good to have you. So, Ryan, tell us about the Poison Lab podcast.
Yeah. So one of my jobs is as a clinical toxicologist, where I work with a medical team of toxicologists and as well as for our state poison center. And, I get to have a lot of fun and I find it really rewarding helping to identify, manage, and treat poisoning for hospitals throughout the entire state, as well as, worried moms on the phone whose child just ate toothpaste, all sorts of things. Doing that, caring for poisoned patients is probably my second most favorite thing to do. My first favorite thing to do is talk about poisoning. And that's because you get all the razzle dazzle of the complex biochemistry and pharmacology without anyone's actual life or limbs being on the line. And you get to have a little bit more of an enjoyable time exploring the concepts that we use to actually treat poisoning. So I wanted to package that all together into something to share with others who were interested in poisoning. And I wound up with the Poison Lab, which is a podcast that covers a variety of topics, but the overarching goal is exploring the science, history, and medical management of poisoning, be it individual ones or as a broad scope of poisonings from specific substances. So we cover a lot of different things.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool what you do. And actually, it reminded me in Canada, we had this little commercial that would go on. It was like a minute about poisoning when you're a little kid. And it was a song. And it was like, don't put it in your mouth. And it's these creepy monsters. And they show everything about don't put chemicals in your mouth from the cleaning agents and everything like that. But that's all I can think about now. Obviously, I did a good job because I knew not to do it. But that's what makes me think of your podcast every time now is like, don't put it in your mouth. It can make you very sick.
Don't you put it in your mouth. Don't you stuff it in your face. Don't stuff it in your face. Though it might look good to eat. Though it might look good to eat. And it might look good to taste. And it might look good to taste. You could get sick. Ick. Real quick. Ick. Real sick. Real ick.
So I think, Neil, you're a little bit older than me, so you maybe didn't see that one, but a lot of people in Canada would understand that. That was a great moment teaching us. And you also have a connection to the University of Wisconsin-Madison with this podcast. It's not exactly with it, but can you tell us a little bit of how it's connected?
Yeah, so actually, I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is not too far away from Canada. And I was featured as an alumni in our magazine related to the podcast. So it was kind of fun. They covered what the podcast is and the different aspects that we explore on it. It was actually really a honoring thing for them to do. I was so humbled by it. It was really cool. I'm actually currently a professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin, which is about 90 miles east of them, but still in the state of Wisconsin. Yeah, so it's affiliated with, I guess, just myself, but I have a couple connections to some universities.
Do you ever use your podcast as a teaching tool at all in your courses?
Yes. So big part of this is sharing information and education around poisoning. And for instance, I teach at a variety of areas. So I teach not just in the school, but I also teach medical learners and graduated medical professionals who need to continue their education. In the Poison Center, on any given day, I have probably 10 medical learners, including physicians, medical students, pharmacists, pharmacy students, nurse practitioners, and as well as nurses and people who manage our phone lines who actually take the calls. And all of these people need didactic education in managing poisoning. And we use some of the episodes. For instance, the people who manage our phone lines, they need to do a certain amount of continuing education every year. And we use a lot of the episodes as some of their continuing education. So it's a great way to just keep people informed on current trends in poisoning or go on a deep dive into one specific poisoning that they might come across. So I use it for that, as well as we use it occasionally in some of our courses. If there's something that I'm teaching, like in our toxicology and critical care course, if I have not enough time to really dive into one topic specifically, sometimes I'll just throw out the episode where I cover it for a very in-depth amount of time and just talk about it briefly during lecture.
I just love that there's a poison center. It's kind of like the Bat Cave.
Right? Yeah. It does feel very official, but they used to call them poison control centers.
Well, that's a better name, I feel like.
Yeah, but nobody's controlling.
Especially if you're calling in because you're dealing with it. So the podcast is really targeted at practitioners then, right?
It's actually for just about anyone with a little bit of science or education background. I mean, when I first created the podcast, I think I ran into something that many people do when they're first starting out, which is you've got something that you want to say, and you're not exactly sure which audience is going to adapt to it. So I kind of put it out there, and by and large, the biggest response has been from the medical community. But I did try to make sure that anyone who was interested could come along with me. And I get emails from high school students in the Netherlands or librarians in Kansas, and they're all, they're people from all over who have no medical training. And they say, this has been a super interesting exploration into the world of how poisonings are managed. We do some more focused research and guideline episodes that are really just focused more towards medical listeners, but I always try to put in disclaimers on those episodes to let people know we're going to get into the weeds with jargon and things like that. Yeah.
I like that. I mean, it's interesting. This show we're talking to folks like yourself who are typically working in an academic environment, and it's either they're creating a podcast to take it to a wider audience outside of their classroom, or it's quite focused on, like we've talked to other sort of more science and medical, like we chatted with Surgery 101 a while back, and like that is really meant for surgeons. That's the purpose of that. But I love how you've tried to incorporate a wider audience that would be interested in it, but yet you have episodes that focus in on the medical practitioner world as well too.
Yeah, and I know that's kind of sometimes a challenge that people come across when they start their podcast. They haven't really defined their audience, and it's so broad that nobody gets anything. No one audience gets everything they want out of it. It can be hard to gain traction, but I think Poison has enough of interest. Everybody, it's got a lot of baggage associated with the word, so it piques people's interest. So you could keep people engaged, perhaps.
Do you get a lot of, because I know you guys ask for listener feedback and listener questions, and you have some segments on that. Do you get a lot of people just asking you questions like, what happened if I get this in my eye, or I consume this, or hypochondriacs? Because I feel like I was scared after listening to some of the episodes, but
Yeah, you definitely, when you run a poisoning podcast, the sorts of emails that you receive can be quite variable, and some of them very interesting. There's a lot of people out there who feel like they have potentially been disenfranchised by the medical system and haven't found anyone to confirm they are being poisoned by this one specific substance. So they will occasionally fire off an email to you. Just working at a poison center, that's a free public access line that anyone can call when they think they're getting poisoned. You certainly get a lot of interesting calls there. So it's nothing new when they come through as an email.
Can you share with us the most interesting call ever? This is what I want.
I cannot share specifically any specific call that I've handled, but the Georgia Poison Center they have this great thing on their website. They put out 24 hours worth of their Poison Center calls and just the general themes associated with it. You get calls for people who, sometimes you would get calls because someone didn't know who else to call. They didn't speak, English, and they were assaulted and they didn't know how to call 911. So they called the Poison Center somehow. Or you get people who, just want to talk, or you get all sorts of interesting things. But Georgia put out a really cool log of their Poison Center experience and covers the hundreds of calls they go through in a day. Somebody thought they were injecting methamphetamine and ended up being magnesium, so they call a Poison Center, and it's like, well, yeah, but did you know that that's probably better than what you were trying to inject? So there's all sorts of interesting things, and about 50% of our calls are from parents at home or people at home who maybe double dosed on their medicine, or who maybe their child accidentally got into some ibuprofen or something like that, or hair cleaner or cosmetic products. And the other 50% are from hospitals who have maybe a challenging or unique case of poisoning, and they could really use some help. We've published a couple of cases that I've been involved in, so I could talk, I guess, a little bit about those. Like when somebody gets bit by a Thai green pit viper that they keep in their basement.
What is that first? Can you explain what a Thai green pit viper is?
Yeah, well, a pit viper is a snake. They call them pit vipers because they have heat-sensing pits that look like nostrils, but they're not a nose. It's a heat pit. And so in America, and I have to assume Canada, has similar snakes since we are only separated by a imaginary border. The pit vipers are snakes like rattlesnakes. There's a couple other very similar snakes like cottonmouth snakes. But when they bite you, it causes your blood to become super thin and you can bleed into many different places.
Ew.
So that's what we have in America. And I have antivenom for snakes from America. But if you say, order a snake from a different country, like Thailand, and you get bit by that snake, we don't have antivenom for that. But there is antivenom, but it's not commercially produced in the United States. So you get to have a lot of fun calling every zoo in the country to try to see if somebody has Thai green pit viper antivenom and get it flown to your hospital so you can treat these patients. So we get all sorts of interesting things. We've had people ingest whole bottles of mercury, which we wrote up about that. People just find interesting ways to accidentally create potentially problems that we get to solve. And the solving part of it is a lot of fun. that you get to use a lot of education and training that you don't always get to use in other
Right.
fields.
It's like detective work. Yeah.
Ryan, when we chatted before, you had mentioned this term, and correct me if I'm wrong, but high acuity, low occurrence. And you said through that, some of the topics you lean into, and that's a really good reason to having the podcast. Do I have the term right? And can you explain what that is and how
Absolutely.
you lean into that?
Yeah. So we call it a halo event, right? So high acuity, low occurrence. When it happens, the stakes are high. Somebody's life is on the line, or sometimes many people's lives are on the line, but it's low occurrence. So it's not necessarily something you're going to end up getting reps in managing every single day. Examples of this would be like mass poisoning outbreaks. For instance, not too long ago in Ontario, there was a mass poisoning outbreak of aconite from a restaurant, and something like 12 people were hospitalized overnight. Now, aconite is a substance. It's actually from monkshood or wolfsbane. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that, but it was called like the first poison. We've known about it forever. It's literally in Greek mythology. I've actually written an entire review paper about aconite, and I published it. And me and my co-authors together have managed one single case of aconite poisoning between all of us. So it's very low occurrence, but when it does happen, you got to have somebody who can figure out how to manage it. And what's really helpful there is the experience of others who have managed it. So in some future episodes, I'm actually going to be interviewing the people who helped take care of those 12 aconite overdoses that occurred in Ontario. And we're going to learn a little bit from their experience and how they managed that. And that way we can have that information that's available for the next person who might run into a potential aconite exposure that they need to manage. So in the world of poisoning, comparatively to other medical fields, we have a lot of halo type poisonings, right? So arsenic, thallium, these are all things that, maybe one person is going to see once in their career. Certainly, most medical professionals will never see these things. By working for a poison center, I'm getting to get a catchment area of, say, my entire state. So it increases the odds I'll run into one of these rare poisons. So what do? Well, I need to make sure the next person who takes care of one of those poisonings has the right resources available, or can at least get the insights of someone who maybe has. And these podcasts are actually super useful tools to share that kind of information. So to get insights from these halo events and put them out there so everybody has access to the wisdom that was gained from them having to manage it.
I'd be curious how you find other experts in this field that maybe have dealt with something so rare. Are you finding people come out of the woodwork and they're like, oh, I've dealt with this before from listening to your podcast and want to connect with you?
I definitely have people who reach out to share their experiences of how they've managed certain poisonings. The toxicology world is pretty small. There's probably 1,000, maybe up to 1,400 toxicologists in the United States who manage all the poisonings, and we all go to the same conference every year, and we all share the same. Somebody says, "Well, I had this overdose," and then someone else comes up to the microphone and says, "Well, I had one of those too, but I did it this way," and it becomes a whole thing. So it's a really tight-knit community, which is nice. It makes it easier for me to know who an expert is in what specific area and tap them to come in and share their expertise with other people. But also I get a lot of de novo outreach. For instance, I recently did a podcast about a medication you might know called bupropion or Wellbutrin. This is a medicine that is really, really common nowadays because of its use for pretty much everything, but depression, smoking, weight loss. It's in a bunch of different medications. It's also the number one cause of very severe medical effects during overdose from antidepressants. So it's really, really common. It causes seizures and arrhythmias in overdose. Pretty safe, therapeutically. And I did an episode about that. And then one of people who, in my episodes, I usually will do a teaser of what the case is, and people will write in their guess as to what the case is, a little bit of a chance to practice their differential diagnosis in poisonings. And one of the guests who wrote into me for that bupropion episode had this great part about how bupropion causes delayed seizures, which is really tricky, right? If I get somebody who ingests a tablet of bupropion, it's really easy when I could say, well, they'll be okay in 4 hours. But bupropion can actually cause seizures like 24 hours later. So it gets really tricky to decide whether you keep them in a hospital or not. All sorts of things you got to think about. But this guest had some really fun insights about it. So I ended up bringing him on the show, and we did a whole section, an entire episode about delayed seizures in bupropion, which I think was really useful for medical learners and people training in the field of toxicology. So it definitely happens spontaneously from conferences or just from working with people in the field. There's a lot of international collaboration, but also just some people reaching out to share their experience, and that leads to some fun, spontaneous education.
I just wondered how you guys do it, because I know it's not really a poisoning, but the hard thing they have identifying sometimes is rabies, especially when it comes from bats.
Yeah.
And then they don't find out until the person is deceased.
Yeah, that's actually really, really tragic. I think there was just a case in Canada of a young person who
Yeah,
died
he
from
was
rabies.
biking. I don't know if it's the same way. It was a few years ago. And it's sad, but like that and poisoning, I guess because they're not common, is that why things are hard to put together sometimes?
Well, sort of. Certainly part of it. There's often cases where we don't come to a conclusion. There's infinite poisons, right? They can all share similar presentation, but you can only narrow something down so much based off a presentation. Sometimes you need to be able to test for it, and there's probably the most sophisticated lab I know of can do about 14 to 1,500 substances. So if you consider that there's infinite poisons, that still means, 1,400 divided by infinity is a very low percentage. So there's a lot of poisons that we can't test for or can't always figure out. What you're kind of getting at is a term that I like to call a toxic time bomb, where you can show up looking totally fine and then eventually decompensate. And by the time that you're showing symptoms, it's kind of too late for us to do very much. Now, rabies is a sort of an entirely different thing. So one of my other jobs is in an emergency department, and we treat people for rabies prophylaxis there all the time, because rabies has a period of time it takes for the symptoms to start to show up. So if you're ever suspected of being bitten by an animal that carries rabies, you usually will get a vaccine for rabies, as well as we'll give you antibodies to rabies as an injection right away to prevent those from developing. This is why even if you wake up in the middle of the night, or if you wake up and you find bats in your house, you're often supposed to get evaluated, because they can cause these microbites that are very small, and you can't necessarily see your skin break. And that's why, because the outcome can be so severe, we just say, hey, go in and get treated, go in and get assessed, because it's way more likely to happen a bad outcome if you never get assessed.
I'm just terrified now. So
yeah, I mean,
well, I think you got a solution. If anything, anyone listening to this podcast, if they have a bat in their house, I think we've learned something here.
I will say I was once struck by a bat while I was walking down the street in Madison, and I did not go get checked out. So please don't do what I did. I happen to be lucky, but even if they hit you, sometimes they do a little bite.
Okay,
that's good to know.
Anyway, that's a little bit of a side conversation.
So this is really a fascinating conversation. Do you do the show all yourself? Do you have a team? It's really interesting what you've put together here.
Yeah, I have a lot of input from colleagues. At the end of the day, the scrubbing and final creation is all upon myself. It's great because it allows me to explore avenues that I want to explore. And that's been one of the biggest values of this show, is it allows me to explore topics and have access to experts that, if I want to corner them for an hour on a Zoom call to ask them about something, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? But if I say it's for a podcast, now they want to chat with me for an hour. And then I get to learn so much from these people and become, better myself, which is really, really wonderful. But at the end of the day, yes, I do all of the production. So I record, I edit, and put it out. And it is, I heard something from a guest who you had on your show. There's this content art spectrum of podcasting. You're either pure content, delivering something that, an audience is going to absolutely need. You've identified a need and you're delivering it. Or you're kind of pure art, where you are making something for the sake that you find it valuable and you don't care if anybody listens to it, and it's for you. I probably lean more on the art side, which I don't know that I would advise everyone to do. Over many years, I'm learning more to craft it into more usable content for people. But I like putting my artistic touch on it. It's a lot of fun for me.
But it sounds like this has been super helpful for your career, though. Your point about an expert hopping on an hour Zoom with you would be hard to do, versus if you got a podcast, they're going to be a lot much more apt to hop on a recording session with you. So I would imagine your reach of people over the years by having the show, and then the experts who've come out of the woodwork or you've reached out to have helped your career?
Yeah. It's hard to measure specifically how, but I know intrinsically the value that I've gained from being able to network with these people and get access to their insights has been super useful for me. And to be truthful, when you're dealing with a poisoning, so to speak, I don't know if you've ever heard about thinking fast and slow. There's sort of, you kind of have your automatic thinking where, it's kind of already built in. It's the thing that drives your car for you, right? It's when I say 2 + 2, you can't not think of 4. You have to think 4, right? A lot of medical management is that you learn the guidelines, you learn the evidence, and you ingrain treatment algorithms into your brain and treat people via those algorithms. And when somebody is, in extreme illness, you need to know those things like the back of your hand. And you don't always get to stop and think, well, why does 2 + 2 equal 4? And you don't get to do what we call the slow thinking, which is the foundational understanding of why we have our treatment paradigms. And without ever doing that slow thinking, you never get to challenge the treatment paradigms and make things better. So by creating this podcast and exploring these topics, I get to do the slow thinking that goes into how and why we manage poisoning and dream up new ways that we can manage poisoning. And this has led me to getting some grant funding to do research for novel antidotes, or at least different therapeutic strategies and specific overdoses. So truly, just by creating this little adventure, it's kind of created the time in my life to get to explore things in the way that I want.
That's great. I love it because podcasts are a great business building relationship tool that I can't stress enough. And that you're getting grant funding to do more research on things that are very important to find answers to. Like, this is why people should podcast. I want to know before we go, is there a poisoning you have not covered yet that you would love to dive into in an episode, or a special guest that you would love to have on?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I'm actually going to be starting another version of the show. I'll probably house it in the same feed, but looking at specifically poisoning outbreaks, right? I've had the opportunity to be a part of a couple of outbreaks of poisonings in my career. I don't know if it made the news up in Canada, but we had a fair amount of people who were smoking synthetic cannabinoids and bleeding out of every orifice because they were contaminated with rat poisons. So we had a couple of those show up, and I got to deal with those through our poison center. And honestly, just in my city, we had some. And then there was also e-cigarette and vape-associated lung injury. Our hospital that we're affiliated actually identified the first cases, and we were largely involved in looking at researching and managing that outbreak. So those are very high acuity, low occurrence events, right? Not even just one specific poisoning is a high acuity, low occurrence event. But now when we talk about outbreaks, it's a lot more, and there could be a lot of lives on the line. So I'm really excited to get to explore with others who have been involved in these and hear about how they identified outbreaks, their treatments while things were unknown, how they collaborated with other federal or local agencies to actually control the outbreak. All these things that are actually super valuable to anyone who's going to end up in this position, or even people who want to know just what happens when these outbreaks are occurring. And that'll be kind of the next avenue that I'm starting to explore.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't think that those would be considered as poison outbreaks. And I think that's the one thing that we think of is mass outbreaks. We just think of viruses. We don't think about poisoning.
Mm-hmm. Well, all things are poison.
There you go.
So all things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dose alone is what determines the poison. So there.
Okay.
Love it. I feel like we could talk to you the whole time, but I feel like you just wrapped it up really well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ryan. This was great and really exciting to hear about your podcast journey. And I think that there's a lot to be taken away. And even folks that aren't in the medical or science world, I think there's a number of takeaways for us here, sort of just general to the academic world. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Jen, another great conversation. It's one of these examples of a podcast that is focused on this academic / practitioner world, but is super interesting for anyone like you and me as well, too, who might be interested in this topic. And I think it's a great example of university higher education podcasts that sort of cross those two chasms of like deep into a topic for those that are also deep into that topic. But at the same time, this is not for everyone, for sure, but could be interesting to a wider audience.
I just get excited about all these podcasts we do in the medical field. Like you mentioned it earlier when we were chatting with him about Surgery 101, and it like makes the content accessible. Now I feel like I can do rhinoplasties.
That's right.
I feel
You
like
said
now
that.
I feel like I'd be a toxicologist. I don't know. This is
Now
great.
you're going to be a rhinoplasty moonlighting as a toxicologist.
There we go. This is the whole point of podcasting. It's like I'm going to school, free school. But that's the whole point of building a community. And that's what I really like is that he was able to put information out there that maybe is not readily accessible because there are only so many of these people around the world. And he gets a whole bunch of people writing in, and they only see each other so many times if they're lucky, if they go to a conference together. So it's nice that they're able to build this and showcase that they are an expert in this field and lets the general public call in with their questions. And what did he say? It was like he has a poison hotline. No, Poison Central they can call into. And anyways, I feel like that's a podcast in itself just to play the clips from like Poison Central.
Yeah. My kid drank such and such.
Yeah. And that's why they should have watched that commercial I've been telling you the whole time.
Bring it
through this
all
episode.
back to us, Jen, with the song.
With the little
one more
monster.
time.
Don't put it in your mouth. Gonna make you sick. I don't know the rest of it, but it's from the 90s.
Don't you put it in your mouth, till you ask someone you love. That's right, sis. If it's okay to eat, if it's okay to eat, like a muffin or a beet.
Like a muffin or a beet.
If you don't know just what it is, remember, boys and girls, don't put it in your mouth.
I looked it up on YouTube. It's terrifying. Production value is very low, but it gets to the point.
We are going to put a link to that in our show notes to that video so you can sing along at home.
There we go. Hey, you get it. Hey, it obviously worked because I'm still here and many kids are still here.
And you're still here. That's good. Okay.
So there we go. Anyways, tune in next time as we learn so many things. So thank you for tuning in to the Continuing Studies podcast, a podcast for higher education podcasters. We hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. If you enjoyed the show, we encourage you to follow and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so you'll never miss an episode. But if you found this episode particularly valuable, please consider sharing it with your friends and colleagues who also might be interested in higher education podcasts.